Okay, I'm going to talk about the three things, really. A few facts about Queens in the broadest sense, in the geographical sense, and then I'm going to talk about how Queens came to be as a landmass, why we're not actually in the middle of the ocean at this point, where we would be if certain events hadn't occurred, and then some of the environmental and natural history high points of Queens. And I'm going to take Bob's approach and circle the borough. So we have this landmass, which is part of Long Island, and it is the largest, physically the largest borough of our 5 boroughs, and but not in terms of population size. Brooklyn has more people, but a smaller landmass. And we titled this America's 4th largest city. If you subtracted Queens from New York City, what remains, Los Angeles and Chicago, would still be larger than Queens, but not by much in the case of Chicago. We're actually pretty close, and we would be larger than Houston. So this is one heck of a lot of people in one relatively small area. We're talking roughly 20 miles from the Frosnick Bridge to the Rockaways. And a few quintessential facts about the borough. The total area is considered to be 178 square miles. 109 of that is land, and about 69 is water. And the highest elevation, we're not talking the Himalayas here, 258 feet in Glen Oaks. You will not get a nosebleed there. So we're rather flat in that sense. And the climate, it's interesting. I had not realized until I was putting this together that, in fact, we are the northernmost city in the Köppen climate scale that is considered humid subtropical. And this is because we are moderated by the ocean, which keeps us warm to some degree in the winter, and we're sheltered by the Appalachians. Of course, we have tremendous seasonal changes. The temperature extremes are 110 degrees between the peak of 107 and -3 recorded in Queens. That's an extraordinary range. And in fact, that's one reason why the waters around New York City have among the greatest temperature changes of any water bodies in the world. Up north, it's always too cold to get really warm. In the tropics, of course, it's warm all the time. But our water will change from 32 degrees to the 70s, which is incredible for water because we have these pronounced seasons. We also have about 45 inches of precipitation, of which about 27 inches on average is snow, but there's a huge range there. As you know, we've had winters with 2 or 3 inches and winters with 60 inches, and 1 or 2 storms makes all the difference. We are a product of almost an accident of nature in a way. There was the Pleistocene glaciation, which lasted for about 2 million years and covered great parts of North America, Asia, and Europe, where a lot of the water in the world was locked up in these giant ice masses. And as they pushed downwards, they eventually reached a point where it was too warm for them to continue. As that snow and ice builds up on top of these locations, it gets higher and higher, and it pushes southward and outward. So it pushed out towards the New York region, and we're right there at the very edge where the glaciers meet the ocean. So looking at it more closely, what we had in this region was the ice pushing down along these vectors and ending along this line, which created some of the formations we see around this region. Right here, Jamaica. I'm going to come back to that. Jamaica is just south of the sediment that was pushed in front of this. We're basically looking at the detritus that was scraped off the landscape being left behind that formed Long Island and Queens. We are truly just the lint that this giant ice cube picked up and deposited in the ocean. So we tend to look at these maps as if the glaciers were on top of the present-day geography, but in fact, at that point, so much water was locked up in the ice masses that the sea levels were about 400 feet lower than they are today. So the edge of the sea was out here at the edge of the continental shelf, and the reason why we have the Hudson Canyon here is because the water drained from the Hudson through this land, and there were Native Americans living out here and mastodons and other creatures, and Queens was not quite yet formed. But at the end of this event, roughly 15,000 years ago, what was left was the material the glaciers had pushed forward. So that left behind these terminal moraines. These are just basically the gravel and boulders that were pushed ahead of the glacier and left there as the glacier receded. And the Ronkonkoma moraine is about 55,000 years old, but the Harbor Hill moraine which comes through Queens, is only 15,000 years ago. So this is very recent, and those very cool places people like to go on vacation, like Block Island and Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Cape Cod, are all part of that same geological process. So south of this moraine, the part of Queens that's flat is the stuff that washed out from the moraine. Remember, the glacier was behind it, north. So as the waters rushed out and melted, it pushed the finer material out past the actual hilltop and formed this flat area, which is the plains of Queens that run towards the Rockaways. So there's evidence of these glaciers if you look around us. A couple of days ago, I jumped out of my car on the Grand Central Parkway and managed not to get killed right where the Union Turnpike meets it, looking south. So I'm on the edge of the moraine here, looking at Jamaica, and from here to the Rockaways is totally flat. This is the stuff that washed out behind me from the north, where the hilly parts of Queens are. And I often take my students in ecology class to Alley Pond Park, which many of you know. And one of the major interesting features there are these kettle ponds. Kettle ponds are ponds that were left when blocks of ice were left in the landscape. And the blocks of ice, of course, would eventually melted, and that left depressions that became filled by the water table, and they formed very interesting habitats for a lot of amphibians and other creatures. And if you look around Queens, you may see an occasional glacial erratic. Remember, there's no bedrock here except way, way underground. It's all just material scraped from North American landscape. But there are these occasional glacial erratics. These are big boulders that got carried by the glaciers and were just left behind. And to make the point about how recently this has all happened and how sort of naked it was when it first happened, in ecology class, I surprised my students. The first day of the lab, I walked them around campus and showed them all the nature and natural history and ecology they don't notice on a daily basis. And I take them to the roof of this, the science building, and we look at this landscape of basically just coarse gravel, and I say, this is Queens 15,000 years ago. This is what was left, naked rock and inorganic material, and then things came and colonized, and in 15,000 years we went from this to the lush landscape we have today. So I'm going to take you on a very fast environmental tour of Queens, following the Sullivan approach of circling the borough. And it's going to be with an aquatic emphasis, because not only am I an aquatic biologist, but I think the more interesting aspects of natural history around Queens occur underwater. But not only. So we'll start with the northeastern corner. That's Little Neck Bay. And this is the last remnant, as you go west along Long Island Sound, of what's been called the American Mediterranean. You know, the long sound that reaches out towards Block Island, that has the rolling hills and the big sailboats, and has its own feel, has the estates of Douglaston along the shores there. And then as you wrap around to the west, the nature of the shoreline changes abruptly, and now we're at the Frosneck Bridge, where I took my students just about a week ago, and we had a great surprise. You know, there's been a recovery of oysters in this region ever since the Clean Water Act of 1972. We've been seeing more and more of them, and there's a huge mania now to restore oysters with oyster reefs that are going in various places. But nature has the ability, if it gets its act together, to swamp the efforts of the people trying to restore these reefs. And in fact, there had been a huge set of oysters. A set is when the larvae come to the bottom and settle and start new oyster colonies right at the base of the Frosneck Bridge. So I shared this with some of my colleagues, and they were amazed. This is the base of the Frosneck Bridge, and there are oysters all over. And oysters are really sensitive sentinels of water quality. You don't get oysters where you have bad water quality. And this is a piece of scrap metal, and they were on everything, spare tires, whatever was hard had oysters, and even to the point, which was really encouraging, of the open bottom. This is a sandbar looking towards Whitestone, and all of these little clumps are oysters that are forming these little nodules, and you can imagine over time them filling in and becoming a thriving oyster reef. So that was a really nice, encouraging find we just made. Going a little further west to the area of Long Island City, we have Hellgate, which is one of my favorite places in New York City. In a book I wrote, I nominated Hellgate as the wildest location in all of New York City. It's almost centrally located within the city, and yet it has currents that used to run at 10 knots, and it's 100 feet deep, and I think very few people have seen the bottom of Hellgate, despite it being right smack in the middle of the city. And originally, it was a very dangerous place for mariners. it was a gauntlet of reefs with currents reaching 10 knots and currents that would spin wildly, and sailors were deathly afraid of it. You could hear the water hissing 15 minutes away as you approached by sail. About 500 ships a year would wash up on its reefs, and it was a real hazard to navigation, but it was a temptation too, because if you went through there, you had a shortcut to New England, and you avoided the storms along the open waters of the South Shore. So it was decided, like we do with habitat in urban areas, we're just going to modify it. So it was both excavated from below and blown up, and this explosion in 1885 involved 300,000 pounds of dynamite. The water sprayed up almost 300 feet, and the vibrations were felt in Princeton, New Jersey, and it was the largest explosion on the planet prior to Hiroshima. So we have taken our habitat and modified it as need be, which is what you do in urban situations. Going a little further, we're now at Newtown Creek, right here. Newtown Creek is a creek that is not as famous as the even more perturbed Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, but it's getting there in terms of its fame. Originally, it was a natural creek that was a resort area for people who would go to Maspeth to go to their country homes. But that's changed a little, and there was a transition period where people were still using it in the mid-1800s for recreation, but it was being built up. But it was basically given over to industry and commerce and our basic needs, to the point where it was a major oil depot, and there's so much oil in the sediments that it's being pulled out almost as if it's an oil well. They are selling oil that comes out of the sediments from Newtown Creek. It also was a place where there was this amazing combination of the night soil wharf and the dead animal deposit area. You know, in those days, they didn't have cars. They had horses everywhere, and every day, some portion of the horses would die. In the same way cars, you know, die on the street and get towed, horses had to be disposed of. So all that stuff ended up in Newtown Creek, and it had such an industrially blighted history that it also attracts this new kind of macabre attention. People have this post-industrial curiosity that gets satisfied by taking tours of the Gowanus Canal and Newtown Creek. So this tour advertised, have you ever been to Duckbow, which stands for Down Under the Kosciuszko Bridge? And for $60, you could go and not only see the ruins, but get a soft drink and a tour brochure, and see these industrial ruins. And this is becoming a popular kind of thing. Going further, we come to a place that Bob mentioned earlier, the Ridgewood Reservoir, which is a fascinating place. This was a reservoir that preceded our big reservoir system, which we installed later on. Right on the edge of Brooklyn and Queens, in Queens, near the Jackie Robinson Parkway. And it was built in the mid-1800s. It was decommissioned in the late 1800s, but its remnants are there. And just as I nominate Hellgate as the wildest aquatic location in the city, this is probably the wildest location on the surface of Queens, even though it is wet. I tried to walk into the remains of this reservoir. It took me half an hour to get about 20 feet through the Phragmites here, and I never made it to the edge. I give credit to anybody who ever actually touches the water here. It's almost impossible. It's a jungle. And there it is, in the middle of Brooklyn and Queens, basically, you know, existing through time, untouched. And around it is sort of a bowl, and it's becoming something of a impromptu nature preserve. A very interesting place, and I recommend taking a walk there. Going further, we come to Jamaica Bay, which is getting a huge amount of attention. I was very involved with CUNY winning the contract to build a Jamaica Bay Science and Resilience Center, which CUNY is going to run, which will be in the news shortly. It's a very happening place, a lot of concerns about Jamaica Bay, and what's unique about the bay is the fact that it's the only national park in the country that you can reach by subway. And that's a pretty novel thing, and here's a great image. I love the juxtaposition of the old salt marsh house on stilts and the subway running next to it. It's a bay that has a lot of problems. It has way too many nutrients coming into it. Its islands are disappearing at a rapid rate, its marsh islands. But it is a birding paradise, and there are, as Bob said, over 300 species of birds that have been seen there, and it's world famous as a birding attraction. And there it is, Jamaica Bay with Manhattan in the distance. And then we come to Rockaways, and This is one of the wilder parts of Queens. You know, the Rockaways jut out into the Atlantic Ocean, which can be a scary place, and it was a scary place recently. It's also very dynamic. The Rockaway Peninsula, because the longshore currents along Long Island run from east to west, has been growing through time. It's very dynamic. So in 150 years, it went from here on the other side of the current Marine Parkway Bridge all the way out to where it is now at Breezy Point. But jutting out into the ocean, it essentially is dead meat for big storms, and you know, we know that Sandy did incredible damage to the entire region, but no more so than at Breezy Point. But also, jutting out into nature, it receives bigger doses of nature, in fact, and here's a really big dose in the case of a whale. It's not uncommon for whales to wash up on the shores of Breezy Point, and sometimes they're dying, sometimes they're dead, and they have to be disposed of. And recently, just actually about a week and a half ago, I just got wind of this through one of my students, and it's kind of exciting. There were live humpback whales feeding on fish just offshore there, and there are some great videos on YouTube of fishermen with whales almost in their faces feeding on fish, and also a school of about 100 dolphins. So we do get some dramatic nature, you know, in some cases in places like the Rockaways. Another aspect of nature that is interesting in the other Rockaways, the far Rockaways here, this is East Rockaway Inlet, is a little known phenomenon where we get tropical fish delivered to us every year by the Gulf Stream. What do I mean by that? Well, in this satellite image, the more yellow, the warmer the water. So this is cold water up here off Cape Cod, and very warm water with the Gulf Stream carrying warm water from the tropics past the mid-Atlantic bight. And as the Gulf Stream swings past with this very warm water, it spins off warm core rings. These are almost like little weather systems of water that go spinning off and end up delivering water to the inshore areas of Long Island, New Jersey, and Cape Cod. When that happens, they carry with them large numbers of eggs and larvae of tropical fish. And these tropical fish end up landing in our various inlets, including East Rockaway Inlet, where a lot of people like to go and collect these fish. And you get these small parrotfish and gray snappers and permit and all these weird fish you would fish for typically in the Bahamas, living here as juveniles all summer until the cold weather comes. And then the ones that are sedentary have been seen dying in place, and the ones that are more migratory probably do make it back south again. And one recent addition to this fauna is a lionfish. Lionfish is an Indo-Pacific fish that can give you a very nasty sting, and it was discovered by a former colleague of mine in Jones Inlet about 15 years ago. Now you can go out and collect these in sufficient numbers to sell them to tropical fish shops. They become so numerous. Going back inland now, we come to Flushing Meadow Park. This is looking at the Flushing Meadow area in the early 1900s from an airplane, and the salient feature there is the Corona ash dumps, which I'm sure Nicole Cooley will talk about later in terms of its literary associations. But the Corona ash dumps were a place where we got rid of our refuse from heating. You know, in those days, you heated your homes with wood or with coal. You didn't have natural gas or electricity to work with. And coal produces a vast amount of waste in the case of coal clinkers. And there were heaps of coal ash here that were 100 feet deep. So Robert Moses, in his clever way, decided when he was building the 3940 World's Fair that he needed to make use of that material and get rid of it and use it constructively. So the Van Wyck and the Grand Central Parkways are lined with coal ash from the Corona ash dumps, and so was the bottom of the Flushing Meadow Lakes. When I go out there with my students, we pull nets, we actually can feel the coal clinkers out there. They took those lakes and made them into sort of big park ponds. Originally, this had been a winding saltwater creek, but it was fashioned into willow and meadow lakes that we know today. And we often don't take those lakes too seriously as ecological habitats. You know, you look at it from the Grand Central Parkway in the summer, it looks like astroturf, it's so green. But it is so full of life, I've been blown away at how much life is in those lakes. And the most interesting life is this. This is a snakehead fish. Back in 2005, shortly after I was hired here, a colleague of mine called me and said, guess what, I got to send you some photos. I saw some interesting fish. What do you think these are? Are they what I think they are? And I said, yeah, these are the dreaded frankenfish. If you remember, there was a big hoopla in those days because they were found in Maryland, and even David Letterman was talking about frankenfish. Frankenfish is an Asian snakehead fish. It's an air breather that gets quite large. It's very predatory, and they ended up being dumped into our lakes here. And the state got very concerned because they didn't want them to spread from here because it is a very dangerous predator, and they've been trying to catch them ever since. And my student George went out electroshocking one night, and they shocked up the specimen, which is the biggest one I've seen. And they get big in that lake because even though it's a park pond, it's actually a very thriving habitat. Moving a little bit to the east, we have a sort of a not well-known feature of Queens, and this is the so-called Queens giant. This is a big tulip tree that measures about 130 feet high. It may be the tallest tree in the city, I'm not sure, but it's considered the oldest tree in the city. It dates back about 400 to 450 years. It is tremendous, and it has a little plaque around it and a little fence, and people don't like to give away its location because they're afraid somebody might hurt it. I'll just give you a clue. It's in the area of Springfield Boulevard and the LIE, and it's actually treasured by a lot of people who know about it. And I'll finish up here at our own college. We have trees and we have grass and we have wildlife, and we often see red-tailed hawks around the campus. In fact, to the level that, if you see pigeons acting weirdly, it usually means there's a red-tailed above looking at them, and they know it. We also have red-tailed hawks that breed on the campus, and this is a couple of ours that were actually hatched on campus. We also have a very interesting, surprising creature, the Italian wall lizard. The Italian wall lizard is a species that was colonized Garden City, probably from an escape from a pet shop in the 1960s, and it's been spreading very slowly on its own because it needs to have winter refuges where it won't freeze. So it's been going about a block a year from Garden City. But some people were so excited about having lizards in our midst that they transplanted them. They became little Johnny Lizard seeds, and now they're all over. So we have them all over the campus now, and they're a nice addition to our community of creatures here. I don't think they're causing any harm, at least I'm not aware of it. And that just brings me back to the issue of our animal and plant communities. One of the big changes about this region, of course, is the fact, and this is almost a facile analog to the fact that we have so much human diversity, but all that human diversity has brought many creatures here. And our aquatic and terrestrial plant and animal communities are now very much a hodgepodge of species from all over the world. This was celebrated recently in a display at the Queens Botanical Garden by Ellie Irons, who made the connection between the people and the animals and plants they bring with artwork that was done using pigments that were squeezed out of invasive plants that arrived here. So this was done, it looks kind of light because she was literally squeezing pigments out of plants to create these images. So here's the connection between Eastern Asia and many species that are now in Eastern North America. And we have a history of moving things around either by accident or on purpose. A famous case is Eugene Schieffelin, who in the 1800s decided that North America should have all the species of birds that Shakespeare mentioned in his plays. So he's the one we can blame for the fact that when we walk out here, we see typically mostly starlings and sparrows. He brought English sparrows and starlings to Central Park and got them started in this country. Our other third species that's most common, of course, is the pigeon, which is found throughout the world. So the percentage of creatures from other places is simply astounding. The one number I came up with quickly was for plants, and for New York City, of 2179 plant species, about 38%, or 820, are non-native. And looking at some of these species in Queens that are non-native and perhaps surprising, we have black-tailed jackrabbits living on the JFK airport. They escaped from a crate in the 1950s. There's believed to be about 50 or 100 of them. And there's been 39 incidents between jackrabbits and airplanes on those runways, but so far they persist. We also have coyotes in our midst. They're not from another country, but they are from another part of this country. They've been moving steadily northeast, and coyotes have been seen living in Queens. There was one living near Jamaica railway station recently. And they, like Canada geese, there are certain species that are becoming more adapted to living in urban environments, and coyotes are definitely one of them. So I don't know which park this is, but this was a candid shot with an automatic camera shot of some coyotes in a New York City park. And then we have these parakeets that Bob Sullivan mentioned earlier. When I took my class to look at those oysters a few weeks ago, we were greeted by dozens of these bright parakeets where we parked our car under the Frogs Neck Bridge. And there are two concentrations of these in the city, one in Brooklyn around Brooklyn College, and the Whitestone area is simply infested with these cold weather tolerant parakeets. And then we have something else we found when we went looking at the oysters. Every rock you turn over in the intertidal now has these Asian shore crabs. These crabs were brought over to New Jersey probably by ballast water in ships in 1988, and now they're found dominating the shoreline between I think Maine and North Carolina. So one thing about exotic species is that once you bring them in, they are generally here to stay. And some of these are big mistakes, some are neutral, depends. So I'm just going to sum up my views about nature in Queens. I would say that it's unnaturally natural. It's not dramatic. You know, we don't have a giant flowing river with rapids. We don't have tall mountains. We don't have a big canyon. It's more nuanced. It's more subtle. It's brand new. 15,000 years ago, remember the planet is more than 4 billion years old. 10,000 years ago, we had mastodons living on this earth, and we had this sort of rocky soil with no plant life to speak of, and now we have this lush environment. We also had very few people. We had a few Native Americans, now we have 2.3 million. So there's been tremendous changes in our landscape, and it is literally yesterday that this place was formed. And finally, it is highly dynamic. We have had these tremendous changes, as I say, over a very short amount of time. So I'm going to finish there. We don't have time for questions, but thank you.